I love the imagery of Sing Out Praises for the Journey, the hymn that we just sang. I can imagine the wayside hostel that Unitarian Universalist minister Mark DeWolf mentions in his final verse, a place where weary travellers can regather their strength after spending so long out on wild roads. There's a blazing fire in the hearth to dry the feet, warm the hands and soothe the soul, not to mention nourishing food and the companionship of fellow travellers. And then, when it's time to set out on our journey once again, we take some piece of that place with us to others who are searching for such a spirit of hospitality in their own travels. At the beginning of his essay on hospitality, Unitarian Universalist Association President Peter Morales asks us to think of a time when you have felt truly welcomed. Maybe it was coming home after a long time away. Maybe someone took you in when you were far from home. Relive those feelings for a moment. Feel that warmth again. See those smiles and feel those arms embracing you. So what comes to mind for you when you think of such a time and remember such feelings? For me, I remember one of the trips I made during my last year in Colorado. I was fortunate to be invited over the course of 6 months to visit the 3 Unitarian Universalist congregations near Four Corners, the only place in the country where 4 states come together and touch one another. The second of those visits was to Pagosa Springs, which, like its sister congregations in Farmington, New Mexico and Durango, was a small lay-led fellowship. Suited to their size, they hold services in a storefront location in a shopping plaza, with a single room behind it that serves for both children's religious education and coffee hour. But that's only part of what made it so memorable. I'd been running a youth conference in Santa Fe that weekend, so I arrived in Pagosa Springs early that Sunday morning after a 3-hour drive north. I wouldn't say that the roads I took were wild, but I was driving for at least an hour in the dark. Still, seeing the sun rise across the land of enchantment somewhat made up for the very early morning. But after a shortened night of sleep, which of course had been on a church classroom floor, and the drive, and then preaching at the fellowship, I was thoroughly exhausted. Now, it was at least a 5-hour trip back to our home in Aurora, just east of Denver, and what's more, the Pagosa UUs had invited me to an early dinner, which would at least give me sustenance for the drive, and it was at this point that someone made me one of the kindest offers I have ever received. It was their director of religious education at the time, actually. She and her husband had a guest room with attached bathroom in their house, and she offered it to me, and I gratefully accepted. And I slept the whole afternoon. And then I took a shower, and then before I had to be on my way again, I enjoyed simply sitting by the fire that burned in the hearth in the middle of their living room. There's nothing like getting some sleep and feeling clean and relaxing by the warmth of a fire, all thanks to the kindness of people who didn't really know me, but who could see that I was in need of their hospitality. What a gift it is to be welcomed, Peter Morales notes. And of course, what he's talking about, and what I'm pretty sure Mark DeWolf was intending we imagine, is how this works in community, specifically in religious community, in other words, congregations. True hospitality, Morales continues, is emotionally powerful. It touches something very deep in us, our profound human longing to feel accepted, to belong, to be loved, to feel safe, to be valued and respected. And isn't that why so many of us come to a place like this on Sunday mornings? So it's entirely appropriate then that Bill Schultz, who was Morales' predecessor, as UUA president some 20-odd years ago, puts hospitality first in the list of things that come under the mission of our faith. To revere both the critical mind and the generous heart, sure, that's an easy one. To prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, that's an obvious part of what we're here to do, given how clear it is that our wider society is failing miserably to live up to its promise of a more perfect union. To witness to all that we must hold the whole world in our hands. Well, that's a direct consequence of truly believing that we are all in this together. But Schultz lists hospitality first, before any of the other things I just read. And he doesn't just say to do hospitality, but to teach hospitality. And even then he calls it a fragile art. This is the mission of our faith, to teach the fragile art of hospitality. Let's unpack that a bit. Hospitality is often talked about in terms of being welcoming. Of course, the test of true hospitality is that the welcome is offered to everybody, whether the other person is like us or different from us. And when the welcome is not only passively offered, but deliberately extended to the marginalized, to those treated as less by wider society, well, then it can earn the designation of radical hospitality. But it's not easy. Good intentions can certainly get in the way, and that's one of the things that makes it a fragile art. For instance, there's a comedian by the name of Tim Hawkins who has a bit in one of his routines about hand sanitizer in church. And he's not talking about discreet little bottles that are a reasonable precaution against spreading cold germs and the like, when greeters, for instance, shake so many hands but can't keep running off to the bathroom to wash their own. No, he's talking about giant dispensers. 2 of them, in fact, right out in the open by the greeter's station at his very own church. And he wonders if that's sending a good message. So Hawkins acts out the part of being a greeter, someone who in what he says is very welcoming, but of course that's not all that he's doing. He shakes the hand of the imaginary visitor, and while asking them how they're doing and saying it's good to see them and thanking them for coming and talking about how we love it here and that this is a place where we can be ourselves and we don't judge people, he's getting a couple of squirts of sanitizer and rubbing his hands together. And then as the conversation continues, he learns that the visiting couple has 4 children. And while saying that we love children and that they're like little gifts from God, well, that's 4 more squirts. And this time it's his entire arms that get sanitized. And finally, he asks them where they're from, and when the answer is Arkansas, he simply grabs the entire bottle of sanitizer and dumps it over himself. Then there's the story told by United Church of Christ minister Molly Finney Basket about something that happened at her church in Massachusetts just last Sunday, a week ago this morning. A story that illustrates so clearly that part of the reason why hospitality is a fragile art is that it requires vulnerability too. Last Sunday was her church's 5th annual Drag Gospel Festival, which she describes as gospel music meets dance party, meets powerful testimony and preaching, meets fundraising for LGBT asylum seekers facing prison or torture in their home countries. It ruffles some feathers, sure, but it's the 3rd most well-attended service they do, with only Christmas and Easter being more crowded. So last Sunday, as Basket describes what happened, a young white man arrived early and sat in the very front row, which of course nobody ever does in most churches. And he sat there, paying very close attention to the service, until in the middle of a reading he stood up and started condemning the whole congregation, Bible quotes and all. We all froze, Buskett writes, remembering Charleston, remembering the 3 school shootings last week. We felt the happy, liberal Massachusetts bubble we thought we were in suddenly burst, showering us with fear that this would end tragically. Thankfully, a number of her congregants who were nearby had the presence of mind to move in close to the man, gently holding him and checking for weapons. The associate minister also went over to him and started talking to him. The man was wearing one of those stick-on name tags that had been given to him as he'd come in, so the associate minister addressed him by his name. And they talked, Buskett explains, about deeply held religious convictions, about their mutual love of Jesus and their different opinions about what God's children look like. And when she looked around at the congregation, she saw that hundreds of hands were raised, not in fear, not in surrender, but in blessing. Finally, the associate minister said to the man, "You've said what you came to say, you've been heard, and it's time for you to go. But one more thing. I want you to know that I love you." And the man looked back at him and then at the congregation, and he said, "I love you all too." And then he left. It certainly hadn't been part of how anybody had thought that Sunday morning would go, but everybody at that church service got a very practical lesson on what it truly means to be welcoming, to respond to judgment and hatred with radical love. Here's a third take on the fragile art of hospitality, this one set right here. For over 2 years now, we've organised much of what we do on a Sunday morning between the front door and the sanctuary doors into hospitality teams. Yes, hospitality is an art, but every art benefits from some structure, particularly when it's performed by a variety of volunteers. But the idea of hospitality teams, which came to us via past UUFP President Alan Sheeler from the UU Fellowship of Center County in State College, Pennsylvania, the idea is really quite simple. There's a lot that happens here on a Sunday morning that supports the service and helps to make this a welcoming place generally that isn't directly part of the service. It's important to greet people as they come in the door, for instance, for both practical reasons of letting first-time visitors know where things are and finding out their names, as well as actually practicing what we preach when we say that we welcome people here. Having ushers at the sanctuary doors serves similar purposes, from providing another opportunity to make people feel welcome to handing them an order of service and helping them find a seat if needs be. Then there's what we had always called hospitality long before we had hospitality teams, and that's the food and coffee. Break that down into discrete tasks, and you've got making coffee, providing food, setting up food, serving the food, doing the dishes, and generally cleaning up afterwards. It used to be that most of that was done by just a couple of people, sometimes only one person. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to you that it was often very hard to find anyone willing to take on so much work. Some Sundays there weren't any snacks. And once in a while, horror of decaffeinated horrors, there wasn't even any coffee. So what we learned from the UUs in State College is that if you take the entire congregation and divide it up into teams, then you have enough people to handle all of those individual tasks without any one person being burdened too much or too often. The teams take it in turn, 1 month after another, and with enough people on a team, any one person need only be on duty one Sunday out of their team's month. In the course of a whole year then, and with 4 teams in all, any one person need only have such responsibilities 3 times. That's a great goal and really not much to ask. You'd only be a greeter or an usher or a coffee maker or a food provider or a clean-up person 3 Sundays out of an entire year. And on all the rest of the Sundays, you can simply come and be part of services and enjoy the hospitality provided by others. Of course, even the best idea still needs to be implemented. We started with 3 hospitality teams, and we still only have 3 teams, and those teams are not big enough. Thankfully, the people on our teams are very generous with their time and their talents, and are often willing to be on duty more than 1 Sunday out of their team's month. But that means that many of them end up working much more than those promised 3 Sundays a year. And I've noticed that when a given team is on duty 1 month, then many of its people don't make it into services that month because they're working out there. And the following month, they're recovering. And by month 3, they start attending again, but then guess what? They're on duty again in month 4. And I'd really like more people to attend services more often, and it's not just my minister's vanity saying that. But this is where hospitality is a fragile art, because it's vulnerable to a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we look only at the bottom line of having to be responsible for something on a Sunday morning when we just want to be here, and if we think that being on a hospitality team will mean more work, and for that reason we refuse to join a team, well then it does mean more work, only it's more work for everybody else. This is definitely one way that thinking individualistically gets us into trouble. Whereas if we think of ourselves first as members of a community, then of course we'll be on a hospitality team, because the more people who join, then the less work there will actually be. So if you are on a hospitality team already, thank you. Thank you for doing so much to make this a welcoming, friendly place on a Sunday morning. And my particular thanks to those non-members who are on a team who help lessen the work for everybody, because you know that this is something that matters. At first service, when she was sitting here, I thanked Melissa Politan, for instance, who was here at 8:30 this morning, making the coffee that many of you enjoyed before coming into this service. And if you're not on a team, particularly if you are a UUFP member, please give serious consideration to helping out your fellow congregants by joining them on a team. Rosalie Pfister has a sign-up sheet. You can see her after the service. She's one of our hospitality team leaders. You can also talk to Sarah Davis, whose team is on duty today. You can also talk to Bobby Schilling. And this brings me to my final point. In this morning's reading, and describing her Methodist congregation's efforts to support lesbian and gay people in the face of social and religious bigotry, Rebecca Parker wrote that we wanted to express hospitality and welcome, but we quickly discovered that those who had been kicked out of church weren't going to return just because we hung out a welcome sign. Well, we declare that all are welcome here, often putting it on our street sign. And we certainly believe that what we have here is very much worth sharing. But what Parker and her congregation found 30 years ago is still true today. The increasing numbers of people who do not claim any religious affiliation, who are in many cases not only nuns, but even duns, in that they say they are done with religion, thanks to intolerance and bigotry and fear-mongering, they're not going to check us out just because we say all are welcome. There are plenty of churches in conservative and even fundamentalist religious traditions who say all are welcome too. Driving around the peninsula, I've seen that on other church signs. But I know for a fact that I, and most of you for that matter, really would not be welcome in those churches. So next Sunday, I invite you to be part of trying to do something about that here. We all know that word of mouth is really the best way to let people know about something. That's a large part of the power of social media. So next Sunday is going to be this year's Bring a Friend to Church Day. I invite you to share your reasons for attending this fellowship, whatever those reasons are, with a friend or a relative, and then ask if they want to come to services with you. This is, I should repeat, an invitation. You will not be turned away at the door if you do not bring a friend. But if there's somebody in your life who you think might be interested in being part of this community, who might benefit from being here and belonging here, and trust me, there almost certainly is somebody in your life like that, then I invite you to ask them to come to services with you next Sunday, November 1st. For this is a place where weary travellers can regather their strength after spending a week on the wild roads of everyday life. This is a place that offers the gift that is to be welcomed, to be accepted, to be loved, to be valued and respected. This is a place where we teach the fragile art of hospitality, striving to live up to our promise that all are welcome, and taking that good news back out into the world in search of all those people who need this community in their lives. So may it be.